Southwark, England, August 19th, 1926. A woman in her late 40s sits before the Catholic Diocesan Court. The Vatican's Sacred Rota Tribunal has convened to hear testimony about a marriage that lasted 26 years, but, according to the Church, may never have existed at all. Her mother sits beside her. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont is 73 now, white-haired, diminished from the woman who once commanded New York society, with a riding crop and a checkbook. But her voice carries weight. Under oath, she speaks the words that 3 decades of silence could not erase. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I always had absolute control over my daughter. The tribunal records note additional details. A guard posted at the bride's door on the morning of November 6, 1895. A ceremony where the bride wept behind a veil embroidered with seed pearls. A secret engagement to an American named Rutherford, abandoned, forbidden, destroyed by maternal will. The daughter is Consuelo Vanderbilt. She was 18 when she married Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. The dowry was $2.5 million in railroad stock, $91 million in modern currency. The groom needed the money to save his ancestral palace. The bride needed nothing except the freedom to refuse. She was not given that freedom. The tribunal deliberates. The verdict arrives in formal Latin. The marriage is declared null. It never existed in the eyes of God, whatever the paperwork claimed. But 31 years do not vanish because a court declares them void. 2 sons were born. A palace was saved. A duchess was created, then imprisoned, then freed. This is the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the countess who couldn't come home. It begins not with a wedding, but with the railroad fortune that made it inevitable. Chapter 1. The Commodore's Rails. The fortune that would purchase a duchess began with steam and iron. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, as he demanded to be called, built his empire on shipping lines and railroad tracks. By the time he died in March of 1877, he had accumulated $105 million. In modern currency, $2.7 billion. 2 months after his death, on March 2nd, 1877, his great-granddaughter was born. Her name was Consuelo. She inherited nothing directly from the Commodore. What she inherited was the expectation that Vanderbilt money could buy anything, including entry into European aristocracy. The Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, doubled the inheritance within 8 years. When he died in 1885, he created $5 million trust funds for each of his 8 children. One of those 8 was William Kissam Vanderbilt Consuelo's father. The money that would eventually become her dowry came from a specific source, New York Central Railroad and Hudson River Railroad Company stock. Later, during the annulment proceedings of 1926, court documents would specify the exact securities transferred to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, 3.5% Lakeshore Collateral Trust bonds. The bloodline of the fortune could be traced, stock certificate by stock certificate, back to the rails the Commodore laid. But the money alone was not enough. Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt understood this perfectly. Alva married William K. Vanderbilt in 1875 when she was 22 years old. She came from an Alabama family of modest means, no aristocratic pedigree, no inherited wealth, no position in New York society. What she possessed was ambition sharp enough to cut through marble. When her daughter was born 2 years later, Alva named her after Consuelo Iznaga, an American heiress who had married Viscount Mandeville the previous year. The template was established before the infant drew her first breath. This child would marry a title. The only question was which one. First, Alva needed to storm the gates of New York society. 665th Avenue was not a home. It was a siege engine aimed at those gates. Alva commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design a French Gothic chateau, 3 stories of limestone carved to resemble a 16th-century palace, transported stone by stone from the Loire Valley. The Petit Chateau, as it came to be known, was completed in 1882. Its purpose was singular force Caroline Schermerhorn, Astor the Mrs. Astor Arbiter of the 400, to acknowledge the Vanderbilts as equals. The assault came on March 26, 1883. Alva threw a housewarming ball that cost $3 million. 1,000 guests arrived in costume. The newspapers described gowns worth tens of thousands each. Electric lights strung throughout the house like captured stars. An orchestra playing quadrilles until dawn. Mrs. Astor's daughter desperately wanted to attend. But Mrs. Astor had never formally called upon Alva Vanderbilt, and social convention dictated that without such a call, no invitation could be extended. Mrs. Astor capitulated. She arrived at 665th Avenue, left her card, and attended the ball. The Vanderbilts had arrived. The architect who built Alva's weapon would soon design another house for her, one where her daughter would learn that marble walls make excellent prisons. The money was in place, the social position secured. All that remained was shaping the commodity itself. Her name was Consuelo, and from the day of her birth, she belonged to her mother's plan. Chapter 2. The Steel Brace. The steel rod ran from her forehead to her waist. Consuelo wore it for hours at a time, learning to hold her spine rigid, her shoulders back, her chin elevated at the precise angle Alva deemed appropriate for a future duchess. Perfect posture was not a preference. It was a requirement enforced with engineering. When posture lessons failed to produce immediate compliance, Alva enforced discipline with physical punishment. She termed necessary for slight disobedience, a word spoken too softly, a curtsy executed a half-second too slowly, a moment of childish inattention. The methods, documented in contemporary accounts, would be considered abusive by modern standards. The results were measurable. Consuelo developed what observers called an exceptionally regal carriage. Years later, the playwright J. M. Barrie would remark that he would stand all day in the street just to watch Consuelo Marlborough step into her carriage. He meant it as a compliment. He did not ask how that carriage had been acquired. 2 governesses supervised her education, 1 German, 1 French. By age 8, Consuelo read fluently in both languages. Her curriculum extended beyond languages to history, literature, mathematics, Latin, and science, all taught in small private classes arranged by Alva. Music lessons filled the afternoons. 1 hour of exercise in Central Park was permitted daily, always supervised. Alva hovered constantly, never allowing Consuelo to escape her surveillance. The child learned early that privacy was a luxury reserved for those who had power. She had none. Contemporary accounts describe Consuelo in the language of appraisal, as though cataloguing a painting destined for auction. Her face was piquant and oval, perched upon a long, slender neck. Her eyes were enormous and dark, fringed with curling lashes. When she smiled, dimples appeared alongside tiny, perfect teeth. The descriptions were not affectionate. They were asset valuations. This girl would later be called the most beautiful duchess in England. Beauty, Alva understood, was currency. She invested accordingly. In 1892, Alva commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design another palace, this one in Newport, Rhode Island. Marble House cost $11 million to construct, equivalent to $340 million today. The Beaux-Arts mansion contained a Gothic room, dark, wood-panelled, heavy with medieval atmosphere. It felt less like a drawing room than a crypt. In that room, 3 years later, the Duke of Marlborough would propose to Consuelo. The setting was appropriate. What transpired there was less a proposal than an entombment. But in 1892, Consuelo was 15 years old and still years away from that Gothic room. What she experienced instead was a different kind of imprisonment, the psychological architecture Alva constructed inside her daughter's mind. In her autobiography published decades later, Consuelo wrote that she had spent her childhood in the habit of searching her infant soul for faults and judging herself inadequate. She was a docile teenager, known only for her obedience to her fearsome mother. Alva's mantra to her daughter was explicit: "I do the thinking, you do as you are told." This was not discipline. It was systematic psychological control, the deliberate destruction of a child's capacity for autonomous thought. Alva was manufacturing a bride the way one might manufacture porcelain, through heat, pressure, and the willingness to discard anything that emerged from the kiln imperfect. The irony of Alva's project became evident in 1894. William K. Vanderbilt had been conducting a long affair with his mistress, Nellie Neustretta. Scandalous rumors suggested he was also involved with Consuelo Iznaga, Alva's best friend, the woman after whom Consuelo had been named. The divorce was finalized in 1895. Alva received a $10 million settlement and immediately redirected her energy toward marrying her daughter to European aristocracy. Alva was simultaneously divorcing one man for infidelity and forcing her daughter to marry another. The hypocrisy was monumental. The logic was flawless. Alva's marriage had failed. Consuelo's would succeed whether she wanted it to or not. But while Alva perfected her daughter like a jeweler cutting a diamond, Consuelo found her own act of defiance. On Riverside Drive, during a bicycle ride, a young man proposed. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. Consuelo said yes. That was her first mistake. Chapter 3. The Man She Chose. Winthrop Chandler. Rutherford was born on February 4, 1862, 15 years before Consuelo entered the world. He was a direct descendant of Peter Stuyvesant and John Winthrop, a Columbia College graduate, a lawyer, and a member of the 400. His social standing equaled or exceeded the Vanderbilts. Edith Wharton would later call him the prototype of my first novels. Contemporary accounts described him as breathtakingly good-looking. He possessed everything except the one credential Alva Vanderbilt required: a European title. The proposal occurred during a bicycle excursion on Riverside Drive in the spring or summer of 1895. Consuelo was 18 years old. The details of the moment, what words were spoken, whether the sun was setting over the Hudson River, how long they stood together before she answered, have not survived. What survived was the fact of her acceptance. She said yes to the man she chose. It was their last meeting before Alva's intervention. The campaign began with surveillance. Alva watched Consuelo like a predator, tracking wounded prey. She intercepted her daughter's mail, reading every letter before Consuelo could touch the envelopes. When Rutherford attempted to call at the house, Alva refused him entry. The doors were closed. The servants had their instructions. Then Alva swept Consuelo off to Europe. The stated purpose was cultural education, broadening horizons, exposing her daughter to European sophistication. The actual purpose was separation. For months, Consuelo traveled through England, France, attending balls and parties where she met princes, dukes, aristocrats, eager to inspect the American heiress. The hospitality was generous. The attention was suffocating. After 5 months, Rutherford had not appeared. Reportedly, he followed her to Europe. Reportedly, Alva ensured they were never in the same city at the same time. In London, Alva introduced Consuelo to Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg, fourth son of Prince Alexander of Hesse, and by Rhine. Alva approved of him. The prince had a title, connections, the proper bloodline. Consuelo met him and instantly took a dislike. She refused him. In her autobiography, she would write that such a marriage could mean only unhappiness. Consuelo could refuse a prince. She could not refuse a duke. When they returned to America, Alva's tactics escalated. She told Consuelo there was madness in the Rutherford family. She claimed he could not have children. Both statements were lies, delivered with absolute conviction. When Consuelo planned to elope, Alva locked her in her room. When that failed to break her will, Alva threatened to murder Rutherford, shoot him. She said, if Consuelo persisted in this madness, the final weapon was Alva's own body. She feigned a serious illness, clutching her chest, claiming her daughter's stubbornness was killing her. A heart attack, she gasped, brought on by Consuelo's disobedience. The performance was convincing. The daughter, trained since childhood to believe herself responsible for every fault, surrendered. Rutherford would remain a bachelor until age 40. He would reportedly conduct affairs with married socialites, including Ava Astor. He would wait 7 years before marrying someone else. But in 1895, as Consuelo accepted the Duke's proposal in the Gothic room at Marble House, Rutherford could only wait to see if she would change her mind. She would not be given that opportunity. Consuelo surrendered. The Duke had his American heiress. All that remained was the wedding. On November 6, 1895, 300 policemen would line Fifth Avenue. Thousands would gather outside St. Thomas Church, and the bride would arrive 20 minutes late, her face hidden behind a veil, heavy with seed pearls and tears. Chapter 4. 2.5 million in railroad stock. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill was born on November 13, 1871. He became the 9th Duke of Marlborough in 1892 at age 21 when his father died. His nickname was Sonny, derived from his courtesy title, Earl of Sunderland, not from any warmth in his disposition. He was first cousin to Winston Churchill. Contemporary accounts described him as surly, critical, suspicious, and without intellectual qualities. He was 24 years old when he decided to marry an American heiress. The decision was not romantic. It was financial necessity. Blenheim Palace was 300 years old, built between 1705 and 1722 as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough after his victory at the Battle of Blenheim. The architect John Vanbrugh designed it in English Baroque style, 187 rooms sprawling across 2,000 acres of Oxfordshire countryside. By 1892, when the 9th Duke inherited the estate, Blenheim was in terrible shape. Agricultural depression had devastated the estate's income. The palace was ready to devour whatever fortune came within reach of its restoration expenses. The Duke needed immediate capital infusion. American heiresses were the solution. 1895 was a banner year for transatlantic marriages. 9 American girls married British aristocrats that year alone. By the 1930s, approximately 350 United States heiresses had married into British aristocracy. bringing an estimated £1 billion in modern currency across the Atlantic. The New York Times periodically printed lists of dowry amounts like stock market quotations. It was such a common transaction that the newspapers published exchange rates. The matchmaker was Lady Minnie Paget, American-born Minnie Stevens, who had married into British society and now operated as a professional broker between American money and British titles. She introduced Consuelo to the Duke during his visit to New York. The introduction was strategic. The Duke needed money. Consuelo had it. The negotiation could proceed. The Duke had reportedly given up a woman he loved back in England, likely Muriel Wilson, youngest daughter of Arthur Wilson of Tranby Croft. She would remain a friend of the Duke's for his entire life, seeing him just days before he died in 1972. She did not marry until 1917 to Colonel Richard Ward of the Scots Guards. Whether this was because she waited for the Duke or simply because she chose to wait, the records do not specify. Both bride and groom, then, were sacrificing love for a transaction. Both were victims of a system that valued titles and fortunes over human attachment. This shared misery did not bring them closer. It guaranteed mutual resentment from the beginning. The proposal occurred at Marble House in September of 1895. The Duke arrived at the Gothic room, dark wood panelling, medieval atmosphere, the feeling of a crypt disguised as a drawing room. He was surly. He made Alva wait. When he finally proposed, he did so like a dutiful cadet rather than a passionate lover. The performance satisfied the requirement. It did not pretend to be romance. Afterward, Consuelo told her younger brothers what had occurred. She could not keep the anguished tears from her eyes. They understood what she could not say aloud. This was not a proposal. It was a sentencing. On the Duke's wedding night, or perhaps during the honeymoon aboard the Vanderbilt yacht, he would allegedly tell Consuelo that he had married her only because he felt obliged to save Blenheim. He was not exaggerating. Blenheim was the one thing the Duke appeared to genuinely care about. The palace demanded everything. The palace would receive everything. The financial settlement was negotiated with precision. $2.5 million in New York Central and Hudson River Railroad stock specifically. 3.5% Lakeshore Collateral Trust bonds would be transferred to the Duke immediately. This represented $91 million in modern currency. Additionally, Consuelo and the Duke would each receive $100,000 annually from William K. Vanderbilt during his lifetime. After his death, another $2.5 million would transfer to Consuelo's trustees. In 1912, a $5 million trust fund would be established. William K. Vanderbilt would also gift the couple Sunderland House, a Mayfair mansion whose land purchase, construction, and furnishing would cost another $2.5 million between 1900 and 1904. The total package approached $10 to $15 million in 1895, currency equivalent to $300 to $450 million today. For this sum, the Duke would marry a woman he did not love. Consuelo would receive a title she did not want. Blenheim Palace would survive another century. The engagement was announced. Alva leaked details to the press: the gown, the train, even the gold fastenings on her daughter's undergarments. She built excitement for what she called the wedding of the century. But on the morning of November 6, 1895, the bride would spend the first hours of her wedding day the same way she had spent the last months of her engagement, alone, locked in her room, weeping. Chapter 5. The Weeping Bride. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent the morning of her wedding day in tears and alone. No one came near her. In her autobiography, published decades later, she would describe those hours with clinical precision. A footman had been posted at the door of my apartment, and not even my governess was admitted. The footman's name was never recorded. 31 years later, when the Vatican's Sacred Rota Tribunal annulled the marriage, his presence would be entered into official church records. The Daily News reported in November of 1926, Mrs. Vanderbilt, now Mrs. O. H. P. Belmont, even placed a guard at her daughter's door to prevent anyone from speaking to her. This was revealed in Rome yesterday, with the publication of the text of the Roman Catholic Tribunal, Rota's decision annulling the marriage. But on the morning of November 6, 1895, the footman stood at his post while Consuelo prepared for a ceremony she had not chosen. Like an automaton, she wrote, I donned the lovely lingerie with its real lace and the white silk stockings and shoes. The wedding dress was ivory satin trimmed with lace. The sleeves were enormous, the waist tight and bound with a wide sash. The train measured 5 yards long and had cost almost $7,000 equivalent to $220,000 today. The veil was tulle embroidered with seed pearls, held in place by a coronet of orange blossoms, following Queen Victoria's tradition. The bouquet, an enormous assortment of orchids, had been sent from the Blenheim estate in England. The designer remains disputed. Some sources claim Worth, others an unnamed American dressmaker, but the materials are documented with precision. The weight of the fabric, the train, the veil heavy enough to hide tears, not heavy enough to hide from destiny. Alva had leaked even the most intimate details to the press. Newspapers reported on the gold fastenings on her daughter's wedding attire, details that by any standard invaded her privacy. Every element of Consuelo's person was commodified, catalogued, made public for consumption. This was not a wedding. It was a product launch. I felt cold and numb, Consuelo wrote, as I went down to meet my father and the bridesmaids who were waiting for me. St. Thomas Episcopal Church stood on Fifth Avenue in Gothic revival splendor. 300 policemen lined the street outside. Thousands of spectators gathered on the sidewalks, straining to glimpse the bride through the crush of bodies. Inside, the cream of New York society filled the pews, though notably, most of the Vanderbilt family stayed away in protest or embarrassment. The Duke of Marlborough had refused to attend the wedding rehearsal, calling the American custom vulgar. He had, however, attended the settlement meeting the previous day to finalize the transfer of $2.5 million in New York Central and Hudson River Railroad stock. He arrived late to his own wedding, reportedly conducting last-minute negotiations to extract additional concessions from the Vanderbilt fortune. The bride arrived 20 minutes late. When Consuelo finally entered the church, witnesses noted that it looked as though she had been crying beneath her veil. The seed pearls caught the afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. The 5-yard train spread across the marble floor like a river of silk and sorrow. The bride's face remained invisible behind layers of tulle. She approached the altar, one observer wrote, like a lamb to the slaughter. Consuelo stood before the Duke, weeping behind her veil. The veil attempted to conceal her tears from the groom and guests, but the newspapers were informed. They published what everyone in attendance already suspected: this was not a love match. This was a transaction completed, a contract signed in the presence of God and witnesses who understood perfectly well that love had nothing to do with it. The ceremony proceeded according to Episcopal liturgy. Vows were exchanged, rings were blessed. A marriage was consecrated that would, 31 years later, be declared never to have existed at all. The financial accounting was precise and meticulously documented. $2.5 million in railroad stock transferred immediately to the Duke, $91,600,000 in modern currency. Both Duke and Duchess would receive $100,000 annually from William K. Vanderbilt during his lifetime. Sunderland House, a Mayfair mansion whose land acquisition, construction, and furnishing would cost another $2.5 million between 1900 and 1904, was already commissioned as a wedding gift. After William K. Vanderbilt's eventual death, another $2.5 million would transfer to Consuelo's trustees. In 1912, a $5 million trust fund would be established. The total financial package approached $10 to $15 million $1895, the equivalent of $300 to $450 million in modern currency. For this sum, a duchess was purchased, a palace was saved, a young woman's life was sold. The ceremony concluded. The bride and groom departed for their honeymoon aboard the Vanderbilt yacht, somewhere between New York Harbor and the coast of England. The Duke would allegedly tell Consuelo what she already knew: he had married her to save Blenheim. He reportedly told her he despised her. She had married him because her mother gave her no choice. The transaction was complete. The merchandise had been delivered. Ahead lay England. Ahead lay a palace that would consume her dowry and her youth. Ahead lay everything except freedom. Chapter 6. The Palace That Demanded Everything. Blenheim Palace occupies 2,000 acres of Oxfordshire countryside in England. It was built between 1705 and 1722 by architects Sir John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawkesmoor as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough after his victory at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. The structure represents the finest example of English Baroque architecture in Great Britain: 187 rooms arranged in wings that stretch outward like arms demanding embrace. The Great Hall soars 67 feet high. The long library extends 180 feet in length. UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site in 1987, recognizing its architectural and historical significance. When Consuelo arrived as the 9th Duke's bride in late 1895, the palace was in terrible shape. Decades of agricultural depression had devastated the estate's income. The roof needed extensive repairs. The kitchens required complete modernization. The state apartments demanded comprehensive refurbishing. Paint peeled from walls that had once hosted kings. Furniture that had witnessed 3 centuries of English history crumbled from neglect. The palace was ready to devour Consuelo's dowry in restoration expenses, and the Duke was determined to restore Blenheim to its original glory at whatever cost. Blenheim was the one thing the Duke appeared to genuinely care about. He had just married $2.5 million to save it. Consuelo's American money became instrumental in stabilizing Blenheim's finances. Her dowry funded the refurbishing of state apartments, substantial improvements to estate buildings, and the installation of modern heating systems that made the palace marginally more habitable during English winters. Between 1900 and 1910, the Duke collaborated with architect Achille Duchesne to restore the Great Court to its original appearance, adding elaborate terracing, classical statuary, a sunk wall, decorative railings, and wrought iron gates. American railroad money rebuilt the English palace, stone by carefully budgeted stone. The restoration was magnificent. The cost was precisely calculated. The irony was complete. The Duchess occupied a suite of rooms somewhere within those 187 chambers. Every morning she woke to views of formal gardens her dowry had restored. Every morning she was reminded they were not hers. The scale of Blenheim was designed to diminish individual human significance. It succeeded. A person could walk for hours through staterooms, galleries, and corridors without encountering another soul. Loneliness was architectural. On their honeymoon, reportedly, the Duke told Consuelo he had married her because he felt obliged to save Blenheim. This was not a revelation. This was confirmation of what she had known since September in the Gothic room at Marble House. By 1897, Consuelo had fulfilled her primary function. She gave birth to John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill on September 18th, the future 10th Duke of Marlborough. 13 months later, on October 14th, 1898, she produced a second son, Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill. Consuelo coined a phrase to describe her reproductive duty, an heir and a spare. The Duke's second wife, Gladys Deacon, would decades later imply that Ivor was actually Winthrop Rutherford's biological son, conceived during 2 nights in Paris with an American. The rumor was never confirmed. The paternity remains officially unquestioned. The sons grew up legitimate heirs to Blenheim, whatever their actual parentage. With her reproductive obligations complete, Consuelo performed her public role with flawless precision. She became a popular and influential duchess, fulfilling official duties with the regal carriage her childhood steel brace had permanently instilled. She attended the Duchess of Devonshire's elaborate costume ball in 1897. She was present at Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901, witnessing the end of an era. At King Edward VII's coronation in 1902, she served as one of Queen Alexandra's canopy bearers, holding silk above the new Queen's head. She travelled to India for the coronation durbar as a guest of Viceroy Lord Curzon. She visited Tsar Nicholas II's court in Russia and was granted a private audience with Dowager Empress Marie. The international newspapers called her the most beautiful duchess in England. Her beauty was remarked upon. Her misery was private. But gossip about problems within the loveless marriage surfaced as early as 1901, only 6 years after the wedding ceremony at St. Thomas Church. By that time, the Duke and Duchess had completely stopped being intimate. They maintained separate suites within Blenheim's 187 rooms. They performed their public duties. They raised their sons according to aristocratic protocol. They avoided private conversation whenever possible. No one was surprised when they formally separated after a decade together. The marriage had been a business arrangement from the beginning. The business was concluded. The contract had been fulfilled. By 1900, Consuelo had satisfied every obligation imposed upon her. She had produced 2 sons to carry the Marlborough bloodline forward. The Duke had his heirs. Blenheim had its restoration funding flowing from American railroad profits. Consuelo had her prison sentence and the daily knowledge that the walls surrounding her were 187 rooms thick, built to last centuries. What she did not know was that Winthrop Rutherford was about to reappear in her life. In the spring of 1900, 5 years into her marriage, Consuelo received word that Rutherford was travelling in Europe. The man she had been forced to abandon, whose proposal on Riverside Drive she had accepted before Alva's intervention destroyed everything, had come looking for her. Consuelo asked the Duke for permission to see him. The Duke, perhaps motivated by guilt, perhaps by complete indifference to his wife's emotional state, said yes. Chapter 7. The Man Who Waited. A few years into their marriage, Consuelo reconnected with Winthrop Rutherford. She spent 2 weeks with him in Paris. The exact circumstances of their meeting, whether by accident or design, who initiated contact, what hopes she brought with her, remain unrecorded. What is documented is what happened next. Consuelo confessed to the Duke that she loved Rutherford and wished to elope. The Duke, feeling perhaps some measure of guilt for a marriage that had brought neither party happiness, reluctantly gave his permission for her to explore this possibility. In 1900, with the Duke's consent, Consuelo went to London to discuss elopement with Rutherford. He refused her. His reason, according to a letter the Duke later wrote, was that he declined to elope with her on the plea that he was too attached to her. Apparently, Rutherford felt too attached to Consuelo to run away with her. The explanation made no sense in 1900. It makes no sense now. What too attached meant, whether it was cowardice disguised as sentiment, fear of scandal, or some genuine psychological barrier, Rutherford never clarified. Consuelo was devastated. She had no alternative but to return to the Duke and to Blenheim. The Duke, feeling desperately sorry for his young wife despite what he considered her betrayal, went off to fight in the South African War. He was away 6 months, returning in July of 1900. His cousin Winston Churchill was also serving there. When the Duke returned to England, Consuelo confessed to having started an affair with his cousin, Reginald Fellows. She may also have conducted an affair with the artist Paul César Hello around 1900 or 1901. The marriage was over in everything but name. What remained was the performance of duty, the maintenance of appearances, and the slow erosion of whatever hope either party had once possessed. Winthrop Rutherford, meanwhile, remained a bachelor. After Consuelo married the Duke in 1895, Rutherford stayed single for 7 years. He reportedly conducted numerous affairs with married socialites, including Ava Astor, but he did not marry. He waited until he was 40 years old, until February 18th, 1902, to finally wed someone else. His bride was Alice Morton, daughter of Levi P. Morton, who had served as Vice President of the United States under Benjamin Harrison from 1889 to 1893. They married at Grace Church in New York. The marriage was by all accounts a good one. They had 6 children: Lewis Morton, Winthrop Jr., John Parsons, Hugo, Guy, and Alice. The family lived quietly, prosperously, without scandal. Then, on June 19, 1917, Alice died of appendicitis at age 38. Rutherford was widowed after 15 years of marriage. 3 years later, tragedy struck again. His son Lewis Morton Rutherford died on February 4, 1920, at age 16. The cause was pneumonia. The timing was devastating. Lewis died 1 week before his father's second wedding. Winthrop Rutherford married Lucy Mercer on February 11, 1920. Lucy Mercer had been Eleanor Roosevelt's social secretary in 1913. She had also been Franklin Delano Roosevelt's mistress. Eleanor discovered the affair in September of 1918. Lucy left Washington and became governess for Rutherford's 6 children. The age gap was substantial. Rutherford was 58, Lucy 28, a 30-year difference. They had 1 daughter together, Barbara Rutherford Knowles, born June 14, 1922, who would live until November 6, 2005. The marriage was described as happy, with both parties devoted to one another. In 1945, Lucy would be by Franklin Roosevelt's side when he died in Warm Springs, Georgia. Winthrop Rutherford died on March 19, 1944, in Aiken, South Carolina, after a long period of failing health. He was 82 years old. He was buried at Tranquility Cemetery in New Jersey. Consuelo would live another 20 years after his death. When the Vatican announced the annulment of Consuelo's marriage in 1926, the official statement from Rome included specific details. Consuelo, when 17 and in love with an American named Rutherford, had been forced by her mother, Mrs. O. H. P. Belmont, to give him up to marry the Duke. The Vatican officially named Rutherford in the annulment decision, entering him into church records as the man Consuelo had loved and been forbidden to marry. He waited 7 years before marrying. She waited 5 years before seeking him out. When she came back to him in 1900, he refused her. When she asked why, he said he was too attached. He married the mistress of a future president. She remained the duchess who could not come home. He died in 1944. She lived until 1964. They never saw each other again after 1900. By 1900, both Consuelo and the Duke had sought comfort elsewhere. By 1906, they would make it official. But separation required more than leaving. It required finding something to live for. Consuelo found it in work Alva had never wanted her to do, helping people who had no power at all. After Rutherford refused her, Consuelo faced a choice. She could disappear into Blenheim's 187 rooms and live quietly as a decorative duchess, or she could use her title, her money, and her influence to do something that mattered. She chose the latter. In 1906, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough officially separated. Consuelo left Blenheim. She never lived there again. Chapter 8. Sunderland House. The official announcement came in 1906 after 11 years of marriage. In her own words, Consuelo later wrote, "We had been married 11 years, and life together had not brought us closer. Time had but accentuated our differences. The nervous tension that tends to grow between people of different temperament, condemned to live together, had reached its highest pitch. She quit Blenheim Palace and moved to Sunderland House in London. The Duke remained at Blenheim. They would maintain separate lives for 15 years before pursuing divorce. Sunderland House stood on Curzon Street in Mayfair. Her father had built it as a wedding gift between 1900 and 1904 at a cost of $2.5 million. For the first time in her adult life, Consuelo lived in a home where she had autonomy. She could choose the wallpaper. She could determine her own schedule. She could decide who entered her door and who was refused. These small freedoms, which most people took for granted, were revolutionary for a woman who had spent her childhood under Alva's surveillance and her marriage under the Duke's neglect. Sunderland House became headquarters for Consuelo's charitable work. Anxious to find meaning in her life after separation, she focused her energy on causes that addressed the suffering of people with no power: sanitation affecting food supplies, milk quality, water purity, drains and ventilation systems, education of children, child and female labor conditions, administration of relief to the poor. She corralled wealthy donors to support the Young Women's Christian Association. Sunderland House became the center for her campaign against human trafficking specifically, the forced prostitution of women transported overseas against their will, a practice then termed white slavery in period documents. She advocated for prison reform, particularly improvements for female inmates. She supported the women's suffrage movement, as did her mother, who had by this time transformed into a militant feminist. The transformation from ornamental duchess to social activist was complete. The woman who had been manufactured to be beautiful and obedient now used her position to fight for people who had neither beauty nor obedience to offer as currency. In 1905, 1 year before the separation, John Singer Sargent painted a formal portrait of the Duke of Marlborough with his family. The composition shows the Duke in his Order of the Garter robes, Consuelo beside him, and their 2 sons dressed in Van Dyck Cavalier costumes. They stand at the base of Blenheim's Great Staircase, below flags and the bust of the first Duke. The portrait was painted as a pendant to Joshua Reynolds's 1778 portrait of the 4th Duke's family. It is considered one of Sargent's greatest formal portraits. A preparatory sketch resides in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The finished painting hangs in the Red Drawing Room at Blenheim Palace. Sargent captured what words could not: a family united on canvas, divided in life. Within a year of the portrait's completion, the Duchess would leave Blenheim forever. The painting remains at Blenheim today, a monument to a marriage that existed fully only in oil paint. The Duke, meanwhile, fell for Gladys Deacon, an eccentric American of little money but, like Consuelo, dazzling to look at and of considerable intellect. Marcel Proust wrote of Gladys, "I never saw a girl with such beauty, such magnificent intelligence, such goodness and charm." The Duke would eventually marry her after the annulment, though that marriage would end even more disastrously than his first. The divorce did not occur until 1921, 15 years after the separation. The delay was financial. Consuelo's father, William K. Vanderbilt, died in August of 1920. The divorce was finalized in 1921 after his death. The original marriage settlement had stipulated that Consuelo would receive $100,000 annually during her father's lifetime, after which $2.5 million in principal would transfer to her trustees, delaying the divorce until after William K. Vanderbilt's death ensured Consuelo's access to the full inheritance without legal interruption. Waiting preserved her financial independence. Her father's money had forced her into marriage. His death finally freed her from it. By 1920, the financial provisions triggered by William K. Vanderbilt's death allowed Consuelo to finally pursue divorce. But divorce was not enough. The Duke wanted to convert to Roman Catholicism, which did not recognize divorce. The marriage needed to be annulled. That would require testimony from Alva, and Alva, after 25 years, was ready to tell the truth. The civil divorce came in 1921, but the real reckoning would come 5 years later, in a courtroom in Southwark, England, where a mother would admit under oath what everyone had known since November 6, 1895. She had forced it, all of it. Chapter 9. The Confession. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough divorced in 1921 after 26 years of marriage and 15 years of separation. Both parties agreed to the dissolution. The civil divorce was finalized in British courts with minimal public spectacle. On July 4, 1921, American Independence Day, a date Consuelo surely chose with symbolic intent, she married Jacques Balsan in a ceremony that represented everything her first wedding had not: choice, love, freedom. The Duke would later marry Gladys Deacon after the annulment was secured. But divorce was not sufficient for the Duke's purposes. He wished to convert to Roman Catholicism, a decision driven perhaps by genuine spiritual conviction or perhaps by his relationship with Gladys Deacon. The Catholic Church in 1926 did not recognize civil divorce. A divorced Catholic could not remarry within the Church. The marriage needed to be declared null from the beginning, erased from the ecclesiastical record as though it had never existed. That required an annulment. That required testimony before a Vatican tribunal. That required Alva. On August 19, 1926, though some sources cite July 29, the preponderance of evidence supports August 19. The Catholic Diocesan Court at Southwark, England, convened a formal hearing before the Sacred Rota, the Vatican's marriage tribunal responsible for adjudicating the most complex and sensitive matrimonial cases. 3 auditors presided over the proceedings: Enrico Quattrocchio, who served as reporter and primary investigator, Francesco Morano, and Arturo Winen. The hearing occurred during the 5th year of Pope Pius XII's pontificate. The grounds for annulment were specified as coercion force and fear applied to compel a marriage that would not otherwise have occurred. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, now 73 years old, her hair white, her social ambitions long since satisfied and abandoned for new causes, appeared before the tribunal to testify under oath. The words she spoke were recorded by the tribunal and later published by the Daily News in November of 1926, making them part of the permanent public record. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I always had absolute control over my daughter. The Daily News elaborated on the tribunal's findings. Mrs. Belmont herself admits this version of the marriage, which, according to the account, was commanded by Consuelo's mother. The newspaper continued, in insisting that her daughter marry the Duke, Mrs. Vanderbilt, now Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, even placed a guard at her daughter's door to prevent anyone from speaking to her. This was revealed in Rome yesterday, with the publication of the text of the Roman Catholic Tribunal, Rota's decision annulling the marriage. The footman who had stood at Consuelo's door on the morning of November 6, 1895, preventing even her governess from entering, isolating the bride completely during the hours before her wedding, was never named in any surviving record. His identity has been lost to history. But his presence, his function as jailer to an 18-year-old girl on her wedding morning, was entered into Vatican archives and cited as material evidence of coercion in a decision that would be preserved in church files for as long as those archives exist. The annulment was largely embarked upon to facilitate the Anglican Duke's desire to convert to Roman Catholicism and remarry within the Church. To the surprise of many contemporary observers, the annulment was fully supported by Consuelo's mother. This required explanation. Alva had spent the previous 18 years since the death of her second husband, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, in 1908, building a formidable reputation as a militant suffragist and advocate for women's rights. She had become a major force in the National Woman's Party, one of the most visible and uncompromising organizations fighting for women's right to vote. She had picketed the White House. She had been arrested. She had funded campaigns and organized protests. The same woman who had denied her own daughter the most fundamental right, the right to choose her own husband, to consent freely to marriage, now championed choice and autonomy for all women. The irony was not lost on newspaper editors and social commentators of the time, though few stated it as bluntly as it deserved. The Vatican's official decision, published in Latin and later translated for public consumption, stated unambiguously nullity of the marriage between the Duke of Marlborough and Consuelo Vanderbilt is ascertained. The marriage was declared never to have existed in the eyes of the Catholic Church. The sacrament was void from the moment of its supposed occurrence. The 2 sons born during the marriage remained legitimate. Church law has always maintained that annulments do not affect the legitimacy of children born during a marriage later declared null, protecting the innocent offspring from the consequences of their parents' invalid union. both the Duke and Consuelo were free to remarry within the church, should they choose to do so. When the annulment was publicly announced, Rome's official statement included a detail that had been suppressed, avoided, whispered about, but never officially acknowledged for 31 years. Consuelo, when 17 and in love with an American named Rutherford, had been forced by her mother, Mrs. O. H. P. Belmont, to give him up to marry the Duke. The Vatican officially named Winthrop Rutherford in the annulment decision, entering him into permanent church records as the man Consuelo had loved and been forbidden to marry. His name, his role in the tragedy, his identity as the alternative to the Duke, all of it became part of the official ecclesiastical record. The full proceedings of the annulment hearing remain sealed in Vatican archives. Whether Consuelo herself appeared before the tribunal to testify at length about her experience, what attorneys or advocates represented each party, how many hours or days the hearing consumed, whether any of the Vanderbilt servants were called to corroborate Alva's testimony about the locked room and the posted guard. These details were not made public in 1926 and have not emerged in the subsequent decades. What was released to the press and public was sufficient for the tribunal's purposes, a mother's confession, documented under oath before representatives of the Holy See, that she had forced her daughter into a marriage the daughter did not want and would not have chosen freely. Alva testified that she had forced her daughter to marry. The Vatican's tribunal heard the evidence, deliberated, and agreed. The marriage was annulled. But 31 years do not vanish because a tribunal declares them void. Time does not reverse. The sons existed, one would become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. The other would die in 1956. The Palace Consuelo's money saved exists open to tourists now, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserved for future generations. The woman who spent her youth as a duchess imprisoned at Blenheim exists or existed until 1964, carrying the memories of those years regardless of what Vatican documents claimed about their validity. The annulment freed Consuelo to marry again within the church, if she wished. It could not give her back the years from 1895 to 1921. It could not return her youth. It could not restore Winthrop Rutherford to her in 1900 when she needed him most. It could only declare that the suffering had been, in the Church's eyes, based on a marriage that should never have occurred. The annulment freed them both from ecclesiastical bonds. The Duke converted to Catholicism and married Gladys Deacon in a ceremony the Church recognized as valid. That marriage, begun with such hope, after the Duke finally married for personal choice rather than financial necessity, ended even more disastrously than his first. He would eventually evict Gladys from Blenheim after she suffered severe complications from an experimental cosmetic procedure involving paraffin injections, a tragedy that destroyed both her appearance and their marriage. But Consuelo had already found something infinitely better than ecclesiastical validation. She had married Jacques Balsan on American Independence Day in 1921, choosing a man who had first seen her in 1894 when she was 17 years old at her coming-out ball in Paris, hosted by the Duc de Gramont, a man who had immediately fallen in love with her and who had waited 27 years for the opportunity to marry her. Chapter 10. The Aviation Pioneer. Jacques Balsan was born in 1868 in France to a family that had built its fortune on textile manufacturing. He served with distinction as a lieutenant colonel in the French military. More remarkably, he was a pioneer French aviator who had worked directly with Orville and Wilbur Wright in the early experimental days of powered flight, when aviation was still more dream than reality. He was an heir to substantial wealth, a decorated military officer, and a man who understood what it meant to pursue the impossible. He first encountered Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1894 at her coming-out ball in Paris, an elaborate affair hosted by the Duc de Gramont to introduce the 17-year-old American heiress to European society. She wore white. She was surrounded by admirers. He saw her across the room and immediately fell in love with her. He was 26 years old. She was promised to no one yet, though Alva's plans were already in motion. Jacques Balsan waited. He waited through her engagement to the Duke. He waited through her wedding in 1895. He waited through her 11 years of marriage. He waited through her 15 years of separation. He waited 27 years to marry her. The wedding occurred on July 4th, 1921, American Independence Day, a date that carried obvious symbolic weight for a woman who had spent most of her adult life in various forms of captivity. Consuelo was 44 years old. Jacques was 53. The marriage took place after her civil divorce was finalized, but before the Vatican annulment was secured, meaning it was not initially recognized by the Catholic Church. In Consuelo's own words, preserved in her autobiography, it was a marriage of love, every bit as blissful as her first marriage had been miserable. The marriage would last 35 years, until Jacques' death in 1956. They established their primary residence at Château Saint-Georges Motel, located near Fontainebleau in France, approximately 40 miles southeast of Paris. The chateau and its surrounding grounds provided what Consuelo described as an idyllic existence, a sharp contrast to the oppressive formality of Blenheim Palace, with its 187 rooms and its architectural insistence on human insignificance. Winston Churchill and his wife Clementine became frequent visitors to the chateau, maintaining the family connection that had persisted despite the divorce from Winston's cousin, the Duke. The Churchills' visits were social, affectionate, unmarked by the strained formality that had characterized Consuelo's years at Blenheim, in a gesture that carried multiple layers of irony and perhaps represented a form of maternal reconciliation. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont purchased a neighboring chateau specifically to be near her daughter, the woman who had forced Consuelo into an unwanted marriage, who had locked her in her room, who had threatened to shoot Winthrop Rutherford, who had feigned a heart attack to compel obedience. That woman moved next door after the marriage she had engineered ended in separation, divorce, and annulment. Mother and daughter, after decades of estrangement punctuated by dutiful visits but devoid of genuine warmth, finally developed something resembling an authentic relationship in the years before Alva's death in 1933. Consuelo flourished in France in ways she never had in England. She became a sought-after hostess, known for lavish dinner parties that attracted some of the most distinguished figures of the era. Winston Churchill attended regularly. Edith Wharton, the novelist who had known Winthrop Rutherford and called him the prototype of my first novels, was a guest. Charlie Chaplin dined at the Chateau. Henry James visited before his death. The President of France attended, free from the suffocating restrictions and embedded etiquette of English aristocracy, where every gesture carried centuries of precedent and every social interaction required navigation of invisible hierarchies. Consuelo felt free, relaxed, and genuinely happy in France. She continued her charitable work, building a sanatorium that housed approximately 80 children needing surgical recuperation and long-term medical care. extending the social reform efforts she had begun at Sunderland House in London. Jacques Balsan died on November 4, 1956, at age 88, after 35 years of marriage to Consuelo. She was widowed at 79, an age when most people would retreat into quiet retirement. Instead, she continued to divide her time between France and the United States, maintaining residences in both countries and traveling between them with the energy of someone decades younger. After World War II and Balsan's death, Consuelo lived primarily between New York City and Southampton on Long Island, where she became a familiar and somewhat legendary figure around town. The days of her international notoriety as the weeping American bride forced to marry a British duke were long behind her, faded into historical curiosity. But she had apparently not lost her aristocratic bearing or her impeccable taste. The photographer Slim Aarons, who specialized in documenting what he famously called attractive people doing attractive things in attractive places, photographed her with socialite C.Z., guest in Palm Beach around 1955. The photograph captures two elegant women of a certain age, both beautifully dressed, both entirely comfortable in their positions in society. In 1953, at age 76, Consuelo published her autobiography titled The Glitter and the Gold. The title captured perfectly the tension that had defined her early life, the contrast between surface glamour and inner emptiness, between the golden promise of unlimited wealth and the glittering prison that wealth had constructed around her. The book was ghost-written, a common practice for autobiographies by prominent figures, but it was based entirely on Consuelo's experiences, her memories, her perspective on events. It remains in print today, more than 70 years after its initial publication, serving as one of the primary sources for understanding the dollar princess phenomenon and the transatlantic marriages that characterized the Gilded Age's collision between American money and European aristocracy. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on December 6, 1964, in Southampton, Long Island, New York. She was 87 years old. She had outlived both her husbands, outlived her mother by 31 years, outlived Winthrop Rutherford by 20 years. Her youngest son, Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill, had predeceased her by 8 years, dying in 1956 at age 58. Rumors had persisted for decades that Ivor was actually Winthrop Rutherford's biological son, rather than the Duke's, allegedly conceived during Consuelo's 2 weeks in Paris with Rutherford around 1900. The Duke's second wife, Gladys Deacon, reportedly claimed that Ivor resulted from 2 nights in Paris with an American. But these rumors were never confirmed by any documentary evidence, and Ivor's paternity remains officially unquestioned. Her elder son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, the 10th Duke of Marlborough, would outlive his mother by 8 years, dying in 1972. Consuelo's will, prepared with the same attention to detail that had characterized her approach to charitable work and social reform, specified her burial location with precision: St. Martin's Church in Blenheim, Oxfordshire, England, the parish church that served Blenheim Palace. She chose to be laid to rest beside her son Ivor, who had been buried there 8 years earlier. Winston Churchill would be buried in the same churchyard just 1 year after Consuelo's death in 1965, creating a final congregation of the Spencer Churchill family in a quiet English village churchyard. The symbolism of Consuelo's burial choice is inescapable and profound. She chose to return to Blenheim, the palace her $2.5 million dowry had saved from financial ruin. The palace that had consumed her youth and her freedom. The palace she had abandoned in 1906 and never lived in again during the remaining 58 years of her life. She chose to lie beside her son rather than beside Jacques Balsan, her beloved second husband, who was buried in France according to his family's traditions. The palace her American railroad money had preserved and restored became her eternal home. She could not come home to Blenheim in life. She had left it definitively in 1906 and built a new existence elsewhere. But in death, she chose to return, to rest in its shadow, to remain forever associated with the place that had been both her prison and her platform. Blenheim Palace endures today, 130 years after Consuelo's dowry saved it from probable sale or demolition. It remains the seat of the Dukes of Marlborough. The 12th Duke currently resides there, continuing a lineage that extends back to the first Duke who received the palace as a gift from Queen Anne. The palace has been open to the public since 1950, allowing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually to walk through the 187 rooms that Consuelo once occupied as Duchess, to view the formal gardens her money restored, to stand in the long library that stretches 180 feet, to gaze up at the Great Hall that soars 67 feet high. UNESCO designated Blenheim a World Heritage Site in 1987, recognizing its outstanding universal value. The Blenheim Palace Heritage Foundation manages it now, preserving it for future generations. Consuelo's dowry saved it in 1895. It stands today because of her money, because of her sacrifice, because of the transaction completed on November 6th of that year. Her legacy extends far beyond the preservation of one English country house, however magnificent. She was the most prominent dollar princess of her era, the American heiress whose marriage most completely epitomized the Gilded Age's transatlantic exchanges of new American money for old European titles. She was one of the first aristocratic women in England to obtain a legal separation, then a divorce, then an annulment, setting precedents that would be cited in subsequent matrimonial cases throughout the 20th century. Her annulment on grounds of coercion established that forced marriages, even when completed with all legal formalities, could be invalidated if genuine consent was absent. Her story has influenced countless portrayals of Gilded Age marriages in literature, film, and television. Most recently in programs like HBO's The Gilded Age, which dramatizes the collision between American ambition and European aristocracy. The final accounting of her life can be measured in losses and gains, in what she gave and what she received. She gave $2.5 million in railroad stock, 11 years of marriage to a man she did not love, 15 years of legal separation, and her youth from age 18 to age 44. She received a ducal title, a palace to manage and restore, international social prominence, and recognition as the most beautiful Duchess in England. She lost Winthrop Rutherford once to her mother's coercion in 1895, once to his own refusal in 1900. She lost the freedom to choose her own path, to consent to her own future. She lost the years from 1895 to 1921, to a marriage that the Vatican would later declare never validly existed. She gained, eventually, her freedom. She gained a second marriage based on love rather than transaction. 35 years with Jacques Balsan that she described as blissful. She gained a powerful voice for social reform, using her title and wealth to advocate for women and children who had neither, and she saved Blenheim Palace, which still stands 130 years later because of her money. The Vatican officials closed their files in August of 1926, The marriage was declared null. The Duchess, she would always carry that title in public memory and in her own identity, regardless of what ecclesiastical tribunals decreed, walked out of the courtroom in Suffolk into London sunlight. Jacques Balsan was waiting for her. The palace in Oxfordshire would stand for centuries more, preserved by her money, marked forever by her suffering. In 1964, her will specified burial at St. Martin's Church, Bladon, in the shadow of Blenheim Palace. She would return to the place that had been her prison. She would lie beside her son. She would rest in the parish churchyard of the palace her dowry had saved. She could not come home in life. In death, she chose to return. The question remains, unanswerable and eternal. Did she save Blenheim, or did Blenheim claim her forever?